Harmony of the Gospels. We are in part 9 of the Harmony of the Gospels. We are continuing with the Sermon on the Mount, and so Harmony of the Gospels part 9 is also Sermon on the Mount parts 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Are you with me? Good.
Yes.
All right. So last week we looked at the Beatitudes, and the rest of the sermon is short paragraph length topics, one right after another, boom, boom, boom. So, we're starting in verse 13, Matthew 5. He says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand. It gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." So the first one it's in two parts, but it's the same topic. It's salt and light. And so first he uses the example of salt as an analogy of people for the kingdom of heaven. Remember, this whole thing is it's describing what people of the kingdom look like. And so this week I went into a short little diversion into the ancient history of salt, which I will now impart to you. No, not all of it. It's real simple. We make salt today basically in two ways. We either mine it out of a salt mine, or we dry seawater. You evaporate it, you get salt. If anybody has spent a lot of time in the Caribbean, you have seen this happen because they do a lot of that down there. They pump seawater into these shallow little pools, and then they wait for the sun to do its work, and then they collect up the salt. You can always tell because there's flamingos in there. Bet you didn't know that. Anyway, that's the two ways. Now, if you've ever been to Salzburg, Austria, you can actually tour the salt mines there. I have been to Salzburg. I have not toured the salt mines there. Salzburg just means salt city. That's Salzburg. So in the ancient world, the Chinese were probably the first that we know of they mined salt. So we still do that today, obviously. And while the Egyptians were apparently the first to use the evaporation method. Now, there's one difference between modern salt and ancient salt, and that is the purity. Back then, it was highly permeated with sand and other minerals and stuff. So if you take a pile of salt today and you just pour water on it, you wait long enough and it will be gone because it all dissolves, right? We know that. If you took ancient salt and piled it up and poured water on it, you would just be left with a pile of sand and all the salt would dissolve out of it. Now that's important because unless you understand how ancient salt was, then this statement by Jesus really wouldn't make much sense to us. But in verse 13, he said, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again?" In other words, all the salt has leached away, right? You're just left with a pile of sand. You can't put the salt back into the sand to make it salt. That's the point. How does this apply to people of the kingdom? Well, the salt, as the light illustration does, which is coming, represents our influence in the world. We use the churchy phrase, our testimony, right? That's modern church speak for what Jesus is talking about. So the question is, how's your testimony? Because you can ruin it. And all the salt will go out, and there will not be a flavor of anything Christian in you ever for the world to detect. That's the point. So we can see what Jesus is saying. If you ruin your testimony, you can't get it back. And so salt at that time is an especially good illustration or analogy of this. And salt was used, of course, to preserve, meat and fish. And the church is supposed to have a preserving effect on the world, somewhat. Salt doesn't stop the corruption of the meat or the fish, but it slows it down, and that's kind of what we're called to do in society. We lead by example in the ways of righteousness, or at least we should. But if compromise or friendship with the world causes us to spoil our testimony, it cannot be recovered. It just can't. I'm not saying you lose your salvation over it, but you're not going to help anybody get their salvation by ruining your testimony. So he moves on to the analogy of light. He says in verse 14, you are the light of the world. Now, this is a different aspect of our influence. He's not so much talking about you spoiling your testimony. He's talking about you hiding your testimony. And so he says in verse 16, let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. I'll be honest, this is a challenge for me at my current job. Everybody in my company works remotely. Of course, we have data centers and people that do that. Everybody, and it's literally global, it's around the world. And so we don't ever get together physically in person, ever. 2 times in my 5 years with the company, our CTO has come into town and he's gathered 3, 4, I think we're up to 6 now, people who live in the Austin area and takes us out for dinner. But again, that's 2 times in 5 years. So Capital Grill, he has good taste in food, I'm going to say. But that's the only time, those are the only people from my company I've ever met person to person. I bring this up because all of our communication, of course, is done online and video conferencing and all that stuff. And when you do that, it's typically all business, and then you disconnect and you go back to work, right? There's not a lot of getting to know each other and small talk. So to be honest, this part here is a real challenge for me in my current job. So I don't know, maybe, and I hardly ever go out. I'm out right now. This is my one day out. Go to church. But this analogy, like I said, is about hiding your testimony. So your testimony can be spoiled by your behavior, or it can become ineffective, or your testimony can be hidden, where, it does nobody any good at all. I remember when Alan and Amy were sharing their testimony of their marriage. One of them, I think it was Alan, made the statement that your story can't help anyone if you don't tell it. And so, while we're talking about this topic, I will just throw out for free. People get really anxious when it comes to sharing the gospel with people. So don't. Share your story. That's all the gospel is. It's your story. If you're saved, you have a story. Tell your story. Don't get anxious about it. You don't need to, know all of the 4 spiritual laws, the Roman road, and blah, blah, blah. Forget all that. Just tell your story. And that's the gospel. Anyway, that one was for free. That wasn't in my notes. Next topic. Jesus moves to, you remember how he's had all these run-ins with the Pharisees? And most of it has been over tradition or doing stuff on the Sabbath and all that stuff. He's driving them crazy by completely ignoring all of their traditions, which I find fun, but, they didn't. A casual observer might assume he didn't care about the scriptures or the law of Moses or any of that stuff. But he sets the record straight here in verse 17. And he says, do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. Notice the specificity in what he said. He couldn't care less about their traditions. But at the same time, he couldn't care more about the actual scriptures and the law of Moses. See, the Jews, when we're talking about the scriptures, the Jews broke down the scriptures into 3 parts. You had the law, the prophets, and the writings. And so the law, the Pentateuch, 5 books of Moses, that was sacrosanct. That's the most important. The prophets, of course, we understand what the prophets are. It's all the prophetic books of the Old Testament. We get that. The writings was everything else. It was books of wisdom, books of, historical books, so Kings, Chronicles, Psalms, Proverbs, Job, things like that. I don't know where Esther falls. I think Esther's, I'm not sure. Probably the writings. But so when he says here, he came to fulfill the law and the prophets, that sometimes is just used as a shorthand term for the Old Testament, all of their scriptures, which included the writings. But it's also possible that he could be literal here, because if you think about it, it's the law and the prophets that made demands on people and how they behave and what they did, right? The prophets would come in and say, thus says the Lord, you better straighten up, stop doing this, start doing that. It places a demand on you. The law, of course, places a demand on you. Here's the rules you need to live by. And he says, these are the ones that he came to fulfill. Not your traditions, not all of your silly all of the, rabbinical writings about the law and the prophets, or the writings and all of that stuff. But here's another thing he said here, specifically regarding the law. He says that until it's fulfilled, it will persist. And this is just such a great aspect of the theology of Scripture that I don't think we think about that much. But it's not going away until it's all fulfilled, which is interesting. Verse 18, he says, "For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or the stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished." It will persist. It will all persist in full. If you haven't done it, I strongly recommend you go onto YouTube, Rumble, whatever your favorite platform is, and watch some videos on the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because you can't overstate how important it is for the veracity of Scripture. How the oldest manuscript they had of the Old Testament in Hebrew, I think was Dark Ages. It was like 1000 AD, maybe a little bit, give or take. When they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was another 1,000 years older than that. Actual hard copies. And so what you realize is that when they picked these things up, and they had almost a very good part of the Old Testament, all of the book of Isaiah, and they took the book of Isaiah and they set them side by side, and it was virtually identical. Small changes in spelling, things like that, but no substantive differences that would make any difference in theology. But Jesus also says here in verse 19 that a kingdom citizen, remember this is the context, who treats the Scriptures flippantly will be treated as the least in the kingdom, but whoever keeps and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom. Notice that it's twofold. He says keeps and teaches. If I teach but I don't keep, then I'm wasting my time. Remember, the context of all this, though, is he was being criticized by the Pharisees for treating their traditions with contempt, and he did. But don't take that to mean that the Pharisees cared only about their traditions. They were very punctilious. How often do you get to use the word punctilious? Had to. About the law. And about remember, the traditions were there to help you keep the law. If the line's over there and I'm not supposed to cross it, I'm going to put a bunch of rules to keep me away from the line so that I stay away from the line, but then I begin to confuse the stuff before the line with the line. See, that's where they were. They didn't mark any distinction between the law and the traditions. And again, they were very strict about keeping the law, notoriously so. And Jesus acknowledges that in kind of a left-handed way, with apologies to our left-handed people here. If his disciples are listening to this and thinking, whew, what a relief, we don't have to worry about keeping traditions, they are not out of the woods, because he says in verse 20, "For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." As much as they want to, attention they want to pay to the law, Jesus is saying the actual standard is even higher than that. And the rest of this chapter really goes on to explain how much higher. And those chairs don't have seat belts, but you might need them. Because as we go through the rest of this, you won't help but realize that the word you're looking for is perfect. You need to be perfect. And not just by the letter of the law, you need to be perfect by the letter and the spirit of the law. And we talked about this last week. It's somewhat of a controversial topic to talk about. You have to walk a tightrope between legalism and what they call antinomianism, that you can just live however you want because you're saved anyway, or you have to follow all of these strict rules about behavior. And so the question is, what requirement does God place on us regarding our behavior as believers? That's what we're dancing around. The real question, though, that's a false question, I think. Here's the real question. How seriously do you take sin? And the answer is probably not seriously enough. And there's, like I said, there's that perspective that says, we've all sinned, Jesus forgave us, so what are we even doing here talking about this? And Paul dealt with this in Romans, right? He presented the gospel systematically through the book of Romans up to chapter 5. And he's made the case for salvation by grace through faith up to that chapter. But then the question was whether we could just do whatever we wanted now that we're saved by grace, apart from works of the law. This is great news, Paul. Now it's my free ticket, my free lunch. Paul says, no way, God forbid, may it never be, depending on your translation. Romans 6, he says, what shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may increase? May it never be. How shall we who died to sin still live in it? And he goes on in that chapter to explain, we are, for all intents and purposes, dead to sin. Now act like it. Now, Jesus is making this point. Your righteousness needs to exceed the scribes and Pharisees, and how he's going to walk through a handful of commandments and shows how you are probably not taking them serious enough. Consider the command not to murder. How seriously do you take that command? Have you ever murdered? I will trust that nobody here is guilty of murder, and don't tell me if you are, I don't want to know. But that's not enough. Listen to what Jesus says in verse 21. He says, you have heard that the ancients were told you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. That's the standard. But he continues, verse 22, but I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, and whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. Whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's not fair, Derek. They didn't even drive cars back then. They don't understand the anger we can... No.
Never met my brother.
Right. Well, notice that he starts in the deep recesses of the mind. He says, everyone who is angry with his brother. Can you be angry and nobody knows it? Sure. No matter what Lauren says, I can absolutely do that. I've done it. But murder is just anger when it's fully grown up. And that's the point. As it's growing, it goes from thoughts to words to actions and ultimately to death. And isn't that interesting? Because that's exactly what James says about temptation. He says, James 1:14 and 15, but each one is tempted when he's carried away and enticed by his own lust, which is in the mind. Then when lust has, and listen to the language, it's birth, life, death. When lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished or grown up, fully mature, it brings forth death. Right? That's, you start with the thought, you end with death. That's what sin does. So, that's what he's talking about here. The command to murder, it starts with anger. That's where it's born. So consider the command not to commit adultery. How seriously do you take that commandment? Like murder, I'm not going to go there. You keep it to yourself. But, as I said with murder, if you've never done it, that's not enough. He says in verse 27, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. Very straightforward standard. Don't do that thing. But he says in verse 28, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. The question presents itself again. How seriously do you take sin? Remember James? He said it begins with lust and it ends with death. Remember Paul? Shall we continue in sin? God forbid. And ladies, don't sit there and get all smug. Because it's not a problem only for men. You know how many women in church would just wag their fingers at a man for looking at porn, but they'll read trashy romance novels all day long. It starts in the mind. That's the point. But pay attention to what Jesus and James here are saying. The sinful act starts in the mind. And that's because of that, Jesus makes an absurd suggestion. Verse 29, if your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you, for it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Now, I don't think he's actually recommending this. He's stressing the point about the thought life. Even if you plucked your eyes out, couldn't there still be lust in your heart? That's not going to solve your problem. Even without your eyes, you're still you in your heart. And, do you think blind people never have lust? I mean, I've never asked one, but, And by the way, with the demographics of our class, we all know that we are the same people inside that we were when we were 20. Just saying. Now, consider the command about making false vows, and here's where we go. Where as you say, we're going to get to it. We've gotten to it. How seriously do you take that command? But Derek, you say, do we really make vows today like they did back in those days? Well, yes and no. But Jesus says, verse 33, again, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. Don't be confused by the phrase to the Lord there at the end. All vows are ultimately to the Lord. We'll see that. This is just a version of don't lie. And I'm not talking about the, do these pants make my butt look big kind of lie. That's not a substantive lie. That is a subjective question. Subjective question. All right. The examples Jesus uses here are somewhat cultural and part of that time period. Apparently, people would make vows in different ways, depending on how they stated it. It told you how seriously you could take it. I don't know. It was a broad system built in with loopholes. We kind of, you know this from when you were a kid. You make a promise, but you cross your fingers behind your back. It means you didn't have to keep it. That's what we're talking about, right? There's a difference between just lying to a person and making a vow, strictly speaking. When you make a vow, you are explicitly bringing God into it. I already said all vows are ultimately to the Lord anyway, but that's an implicit thing. Whereas a vow, it's an explicit thing. Yeah, but you didn't, you should always keep your word. But don't you think, as bad as a lie is, it's even worse to call on God to witness to your lie. And that's what a vow is, if you're lying. But the people of the first century, they would categorize the things they swore by. If you swear by the temple or by the altar, it was considered not as binding, which begs the question, why would anybody accept your vow if you vowed by the temple or the altar? I don't know. He doesn't explain. I don't know. I don't understand any of that. Maybe it's just you said it in your head and not to the other person, like the fingers behind the back thing. I don't know. We see this sometimes. People will say, oh, I swear on my mother's grave or something like that, whatever. The overarching idea is still, are you telling me the truth? When you play games with your word, people won't trust you, and they shouldn't trust you. Why? Because you're a big fat liar. That's why. If you promise, and if you promise to do something and you know you're not going to do it, when you make the promise, you're a big fat liar. And you can couch it in any kind of words you want, but it doesn't matter. Now, I'm not saying that sometimes we promise to do something and then circumstances make it impossible for us to keep our promise. But if we're honest, sometimes circumstances just make it hard to keep our promise, not impossible. My brother is the best example of this I can think of. His first company was the victim of essentially an embezzlement from his partner. He was a hair's breadth away from bankruptcy, and any normal person would have gone that route, declared bankruptcy, and started fresh. He decided his word was worth more than a quick fix. And he got all of his, creditors on board. It took him years, but he was able to work his way out of debt, grow the business, and get past it. That's keeping your word, right? Even when you have every excuse that anyone would accept legally. He could have gone after the partner legally. He could have declared bankruptcy. He didn't do any of that. If you go a different way and to do the right thing, no matter how hard it is, that's what Jesus is talking about. And he summarizes it here in verse 37. But let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond these is evil. Keep your word. Don't lie. No excuses, no loopholes. Now, next, we get to one that I really just wanted to skip over. Really, the last two are just darn inconvenient. Really can't do that. Verse 38, Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now, you're probably all thinking, okay, Derek, why did you want to skip that one? Do you have harbor some horrible grudge deep down in your heart? Only for Patrick Rothfuss. No, he's all right. He's an author. He wrote, so he's got this trilogy, and he wrote the first 2 books, and it's been over 10 years, and he put out and it wouldn't be a problem if the first 2 books weren't so good.
I had an author like that. I was mad until I found out he died of a heart attack halfway through the first chapter.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and you check on his welfare?
Yeah, he's on Twitch. He plays video games. Put down the joystick and finish the book. Anyway, we know where he is. Anyway, remember, okay, back to this. Bring it back, people.
But I'm not bitter.
Remember the overarching theme of the Sermon on the Mount. Description of kingdom people, and this is what citizens of the kingdom of heaven look like. This is how they act. This is how you can spot them. Instead of seeking vengeance, Jesus says, verse 39, but I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. I told you I wanted to skip this. Now you know why. In a lot of ways, this reminds me of what I just told you about my brother. You have the right to justice. You have the right to demand fair treatment. But what if you just took the loss and went on with your life? What would happen then? You know what happened? People would realize you're not normal, and they might want to wonder why. You are not at all like them if you do that. You know, when Lauren was pregnant with Alan, our oldest, she was in an unfortunate car accident. A young man on a wet street in a fast car ran a red light, hit her and a couple other cars in the intersection. She wasn't hurt. The car wasn't totaled, just a little banged up. But here's the backstory to this. A year before that happened, I got called to jury duty, and I was excused by the judge because I told the judge, I have a problem with all this pain and suffering lawsuit crap, right? Now, because when I grew up in New Jersey, I don't see as much of it down here. Maybe I'm just naive, but in New Jersey, if you got hit by somebody, that was like hitting the lottery. Man, you get a big fat check.
We don't have that in the Irish.
So I got excused because of that. And here we are a year later, and all of a sudden Lauren gets hit. Well, what am I going to do? We did nothing. We could have sued. She was pregnant. Do you have any idea how well that would have played in front of a jury? But it was very obvious that as long as they covered the trip to the hospital so they could check out the baby and whatever repairs to the car, I should be happy with that. And they did. And I was happy with that. And also, I really hate being a hypocrite. Even that is not what Jesus is talking about. Because basically we came out even, right? Alan was fine. Well, I mean, you've met Alan. As fine as he is.
That explains a lot.
It does, yeah. But Jesus is saying, you pay for the trip to the hospital. You pay for fixing your car. You take the loss. That's what he's saying here. And people will recognize you as obviously one of the kingdom people if you did that. I told you I wanted to skip these sections. Finally, Jesus takes it up another notch. Verse 43, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Oh no, where is this going? You already know. Verse 44, but I say to you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. This one's hard. We all know it's hard. I'll be honest, I never really, I taught through this before. I think this is the first time I've taught through this since what I'm about to share with you happened. I never had any real experience with real enemies. I mean, of course there are people that don't like me. There's probably people here that don't like me, but whatever. I never had to really deal with an enemy until, maybe a few years ago, maybe 10, getting on 10 years. Wow, time flies. I had a guy at work that just had it out for me. He made my life a living hell. I don't know why, but it got to, and he had power over me. And it got to the point where I had to leave the job and find another job. Now, forget the details of it. It's not important. Let's just say it was my first time I had a real bona fide enemy. I'm not, like I said, people don't like me, that's fine. But somebody who actually purposefully caused me harm, right? That was new. And honestly, it's rare if you really think about it. People say stuff about you, who cares? But when somebody actually purposefully caused you harm, how do you treat that? And I'll be honest, not well at first, but I finally got to the place where I was able to start praying for him. And I'm not going to tell you how long, to my everlasting shame, it took me to get there. But, I heard something years ago that when there's somebody that you have conflict with, how do you deal with that person? And the advice was, see them as if God had redeemed them. What could they be? See them through God's eyes of, if you picture how God could transform them, their personality, all of the good things about them into a kingdom person, what would that look like? And pray for that to happen, right? That's where your focus should be. And I've actually really started praying for this guy like that now. So I will share this. What really delayed my getting to that point was that some of the guys I worked with at that company told me later that he basically got demoted, and fired after I left. I really enjoyed that.
Which is hard to let go.
It was, and it only delayed my actually getting to a place where I could pray for him. C.S. Lewis wrote about, was it C.S. Lewis, I think, said if there's somebody you don't like and you do them a bad turn, as he put it, you'll only end up disliking them more. But if you do something good for them, you will at least dislike them less. You may even start to love them. And so praying for them is a great way to start loving the person. Jesus says we need to do this, and he tells us the reason. It's not just the reason of loving our enemies, it's the reason for everything he just said, and it's the theme of the whole sermon, which has 2 more chapters to go. He says in verse 45, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. We will obviously be seen as kingdom people if we are like this. But in this one, it's a little different. No one will know if you're praying for your enemy. I mean, because I told you, hey, putting my righteousness out there. Remember how the external sins that needed to be avoided, but also the internal ones we saw earlier? Now the remedy is not external, it's internal. Remember how the Pharisees did everything to be noticed by others? We actually get into that. That's next week. That's the next chapter, chapter 6. But this is the setup for it. So you're like, okay, what does God want from us anyway? Which is a great question. Fortunately, it's answered right here, verse 48. Therefore, you are to be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. That's your standard. Anything else is you not taking sin seriously. I'm not saying you don't sin, but do you take it seriously? Take it seriously, is what he's saying. All right.